Chapter 1. White Noise. There is a sound that exists at the edge of everything we know. It is not music. It is not language. It is not the wind or the sea or the hum of electrical wires strung between forgotten towns. It does not come from any instrument that human hands have built, and it does not travel through any medium that human science has fully mapped. Most people never hear it. Most people live their entire lives within the comfortable boundaries of the audible world, birdsong and traffic, conversation and silence, the predictable rhythm of a universe that behaves more or less the way we expect it to. But some people hear it. And once they do, nothing is ever quite the same. This is the story of a signal. A transmission received on a cold November night at a remote radio observatory in the high desert of New Mexico. A signal that lasted exactly 4 hours, 17 minutes, and 8 seconds before disappearing as completely and as suddenly as it had arrived. A signal that, in the weeks and months that followed, would consume the careers of 3 scientists, shatter 2 marriages, and leave at least 1 person permanently and irrevocably changed in ways that medicine could not explain and language could barely contain. This is also the story of what the signal said. Or rather, what those who listened to it long enough believed it was saying. We will not draw conclusions here. That is not what this account is for. What we will do is lay out the facts as they were documented, the testimonies as they were given, and the questions that remain years later entirely unanswered. You are welcome to form your own interpretation. Most people who hear this story do. The Ridgeback Array sits approximately 47 miles southeast of Socorro, New Mexico, at an elevation of just under 5,000 feet. It is not the most famous radio observatory in the world. That distinction belongs to the Very Large Array, which sits nearby and which most people recognize from photographs and science documentaries, and at least one moderately successful film from the 1990s. The Ridgeback Array is smaller, less well-funded, and operated by a consortium of 3 universities whose names are not important for our purposes here. What is important is that on the night of 14th November, the array was staffed by exactly 2 people. Dr. Mara Chen, a 41-year-old astrophysicist from the University of New Mexico, had been working at the facility for 6 years. She was, by all accounts, a methodical and precise scientist, the kind of person who double-checked calibration readings not because she expected to find errors, but because the habit of checking was itself a form of discipline she had come to value. Her colleagues described her as quiet, focused, and difficult to surprise. The second person on duty that night was a graduate student named Owen Price. Owen was 26, in the second year of his doctoral program, and had drawn the overnight shift through a combination of bad luck and poor scheduling. He had brought a thermos of coffee, a thick novel he would not end up reading, and a set of wireless headphones he used to listen to music during the long, uneventful stretches between data checks. Neither of them was expecting anything unusual. The night began, as most nights at the array began, with routine. Chapter 2. 14th November. The control room at Ridgeback is not a glamorous space. It is a long, low-ceilinged room with fluorescent lights that hum faintly and flicker occasionally and have been due for replacement for longer than anyone can remember. The walls are covered in acoustic panels that were once white and have since faded to a shade of yellowish cream. There are 6 workstations arranged into rows, each equipped with monitors showing feeds from the various dishes in the array. At the far end of the room, a large central display shows a composite view, all data streams layered together, a visual representation of everything the array is currently receiving from the sky. At 8:47 p.m., Dr. Chen arrived to relieve the evening shift. She exchanged a few words with the outgoing technician, a brief discussion of some minor calibration drift in dish 3 that had been logged earlier in the day and appeared to have self-corrected, and then settled into her workstation with a cup of tea she had made in the small kitchen adjacent to the main room. Owen arrived at 9:15 p.m., slightly later than scheduled. He apologized. Dr. Chen acknowledged the apology with a nod and directed him to the secondary monitoring station, where his job for the evening was to watch for any flagged anomalies in the incoming data stream and log them according to the standard protocol. For the first 2 hours, there was nothing to log. The sky above New Mexico on that particular night was exceptionally clear. There was no moon, the lunar cycle placed it at new moon, the darkest phase, and the absence of moonlight meant the stars were extraordinarily bright. From the small window at the back of the control room, if you stood at just the right angle, you could see the Milky Way as a faint smear of white across the southern sky, like something wiped carelessly across a blackboard and never quite erased. Owen, during a lull in data activity, stood at that window for several minutes. He mentioned this later, in his testimony. He said he had been thinking about how strange it was to work in a place designed specifically to listen to the sky while also being surrounded by the kind of darkness that made you feel, in some wordless way, that the sky was also listening back. Dr. Chen, who was reviewing archived signal data from the previous week on her monitor, did not notice that Owen had moved away from his station. This is relevant because it was Owen standing at the window, not at his console, who first heard it. Not with the array's instruments. Not through any official monitoring channel. With his own ears. He described it in his initial report, filed 3 days after the event, as follows. I was standing at the rear observation window, facing south. The control room was quiet, just the hum of the equipment and the HVAC system. At approximately 11:08 p.m., I became aware of a sound that I initially attributed to the HVAC. It was a low frequency, very low, below the range where you'd normally register it as a specific pitch, and it had a quality I can only describe as directional. Meaning, it seemed to be coming from one specific place outside, rather than from the building systems. I moved away from the window and the sound persisted. I returned to my station. The sound continued for what I estimate was 3 to 4 minutes before it changed. When it changed, it became something I cannot easily describe. It remained low in frequency but developed what I can only call internal structure, a pattern within the sound, like rhythm within static. I said to Dr. Chen, "Do you hear that?" She said she did not. I took off my headphones, which I had been wearing around my neck, and confirmed that they were not a source. The sound continued. At 11:12 p.m., the anomaly alert on my console activated. The anomaly alert. In the standard operating protocol of the Ridgeback array, an anomaly alert is triggered when incoming signal data deviates from expected background parameters by a margin greater than 4.2 standard deviations. This threshold was chosen specifically to filter out the vast majority of natural signal variations, solar interference, satellite crosstalk, atmospheric scatter, while still flagging anything genuinely unusual. In 6 years of operation, The alert had been triggered 47 times. Of those 47 instances, 43 had been traced, within hours, to known sources. Satellite drift, military transmission bleed over, equipment malfunction. The remaining 4 had been logged as unexplained and filed in the archive under the category designation that researchers at the array referred to, with a mixture of dry humor and genuine unease, as the interesting drawer. The alert that triggered at 11:12 p.m. on 14th November would not go in the interesting drawer. It would eventually require its own filing system entirely. Dr. Chen's account of the next 4 minutes is more precise than Owen's, because precision was, as we noted, her default mode. The alert triggered at 11:12 and 7 seconds p.m. I cross-checked the primary feed against the backup feed. Both showed the same anomaly. Signal origin appeared to be consistent across all 4 dishes that were currently active, which ruled out equipment fault on any individual unit. I ran a quick source check against the current catalog, known pulsars, cursor positions, satellite orbital data, and found no match. The signal was not coming from a cataloged source. At this point, I asked Owen to pull up the frequency spectrum and confirm the reading. He confirmed. The signal was centered at 1420 MHz, the hydrogen line. This is the frequency at which neutral hydrogen atoms emit radio waves. It is also the frequency that, since the 1950S has been considered by the scientific community as the most likely carrier frequency for any intentional interstellar communication, precisely because any spacefaring civilization would understand that hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe and would therefore be aware of its characteristic frequency. I want to be very clear about something. My noting this fact was not, at that moment, an expression of belief in any particular hypothesis about the signal's origin. It was an observation. The frequency was notable. That is all I recorded. But I did record it. Chapter 3. The shape of the sound. There is a concept in signal analysis called the waterfall display. It is a visual representation of incoming frequency data plotted over time, frequency on one axis, time on the other, with signal intensity represented by color. A strong signal at a consistent frequency appears as a bright vertical line against the darker background of noise. A changing signal appears as a shape, curves, spikes, patterns. When Dr. Chen pulled up the waterfall display for the incoming signal at 11:16 p.m., she saw something that made her set down her tea. The signal was not a line. It was not a spike. It was not any of the common shapes that years of experience had trained her to recognize and categorize. The signal was a shape she had never seen before. She would later describe it, in a paper submitted to the Journal of Astrophysical Research and subsequently rejected on grounds of insufficient peer verification, as follows. The waterfall display showed what I can only describe as a nested repeating structure. The primary carrier, the 1420 MHz hydrogen line, was flanked on both sides by a series of secondary tones at precise mathematical intervals. These intervals were not random. They conformed to a pattern that I recognized, after approximately 12 minutes of analysis, as a sequence of prime numbers expressed as frequency ratios. The signal was, in essence, counting. Not in any human numbering system, but in a system that any entity capable of advanced mathematics would construct independently. The primes 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13, 17, 19, 23, and then continuing beyond the range of our standard display settings. Within the prime sequence structure, there was a second layer of patterning that I did not fully analyze during the observation period. Owen Price identified it first. He described it as something inside the counting. I asked him to be more specific. He said, "It's like the numbers are a container. And there's something in the container that isn't numbers." I did not know what to make of this description at the time. I recorded it in the log. Owen, for his part, has given multiple accounts of what he perceived in that secondary layer, and the accounts are consistent with one another in their outline while varying in their detail, which is, interestingly, exactly the pattern you would expect from someone describing a genuine perceptual experience rather than a fabricated one. Fabricated accounts tend toward false precision and consistency. Real memories shift and blur at the edges while holding firm at the center. At the center of all Owen's accounts is this. The sound, which by this point was being routed through the control room's speakers at low volume, overlaid with the raw data feed, had begun to feel, in his words, like it was aware. He was careful to distance himself from the obvious interpretation of this phrase. He was not claiming, he consistently emphasized, that the signal was intelligent in any provable sense. What he was describing was a subjective perceptual quality, the same quality, he suggested, that you might experience when you enter a room and have the sudden conviction that someone has recently been in it, even though the room appears empty. A residue of presence. An atmosphere of attention. It felt, he said, in an interview recorded approximately 8 months after the event, like being looked at by something that had no eyes. He paused after saying this, and then added, "I know how that sounds." The interviewer, a journalist from a science publication who would ultimately decline to print the piece, said, "How does it sound to you?" Owen thought for a moment. "It sounds like the most accurate thing I know how to say," he said. Chapter 4. Protocol and Instinct. At 11:34 p.m. Dr. Chen made a decision that she would later describe as simultaneously correct and insufficient. She initiated the Ridgeback Array's official anomalous signal protocol, a structured set of procedures established in the facility's operating manual for exactly this type of situation. The protocol required her to, in sequence, verify the signal across all available dishes, attempt to triangulate a directional source, cross-reference against all available catalogs, attempt to identify natural explanations, document all findings in real time, and notify the facility director. She did all of these things, in that order, with methodical care. The signal was verified across all dishes. Triangulation placed its apparent source in a region of sky in the constellation Ophiuchus at a position that corresponded to no known catalogued object. Cross-referencing confirmed no natural explanation, no pulsar, no magnetar, no known astrophysical phenomenon produced signals of this specific structure. Documentation was thorough and continuous. And at 11:41 p.m., Dr. Chen called the facility director, Dr. Howard Ray. Dr. Ray was at home in Albuquerque, in bed. He answered his phone on the 4th ring. Dr. Chen explained, concisely and precisely, what the array was receiving. There was a silence on the line. Then Dr. Ray said, "Record everything. I'll be there in 2 hours. Don't contact anyone else until I arrive." Dr. Chen said, "Of course." She returned to her workstation. Owen, who had been listening to this exchange while monitoring his console, said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Do you believe it? The source location?" Dr. Chen considered the question. "The triangulation is consistent with multiple independent measurements," she said. "There's no instrumental reason to doubt it." "That's not what I asked," Owen said. Another pause. "No, Dr. Chen said quietly. "It's not. The source location Ophiuchus, roughly 600 light-years from Earth, in the direction of the galactic center. The specific coordinates corresponded to a region of space that had no entry in any stellar catalog, not because it had been examined and found empty, but because it had never been examined at all. It was a gap in the survey data, a patch of sky that had fallen between the coverage areas of multiple independent telescope programs and consequently never received systematic observation. A patch of sky that, for all practical purposes, science had not yet looked at. And from which, on this particular November night, something appeared to be transmitting. Dr. Rail arrived at 1:23 a.m. He was a tall, angular man in his mid-50s who had dedicated his career to the search for anomalous cosmic signals, work that his more conventionally successful colleagues sometimes described, with varying degrees of cruelty, as ambitious or speculative. He had published extensively on the theoretical parameters of technosignatures and had spoken publicly, on multiple occasions, about the statistical improbability of humanity being alone in the universe. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of person who should have been excited by what the Ridgeback Array was receiving. But the first thing Owen noticed, when Dr. Rail walked into the control room and stood before the central display showing the waterfall of the signal, was that he did not look excited. He looked frightened. He stood in silence for approximately 3 minutes, studying the display. Then he sat down at the nearest workstation and began reviewing the raw data logs, scrolling through them quickly, occasionally stopping and rereading a particular section. No one spoke. After 11 minutes, Dr. Rail looked up. "Has anyone attempted to decode the secondary layer?" he asked. "Not formally, Dr. Chen said. We've identified the prime sequence structure in the primary." Owen observed what appeared to be additional patterning in the secondary, "but we haven't had time to." "Don't, Dr. Rail said. A silence. "Don't decode it?" Dr. Chen asked. "Not yet, Dr. Rail said. He looked at Owen. "You said you heard something in the secondary layer. Describe it." Owen described it. Dr. Rail listened without interrupting. When Owen finished, Dr. Rail nodded slowly, as if something had been confirmed rather than revealed. "How long has the signal been active?" he asked. 2 hours, 7 minutes, Dr. Chen said. "And it's shown no signs of terminating?" "None." Dr. Rail was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that neither Dr. Chen nor Owen fully understood at the time, but which both of them would think about repeatedly in the months and years that followed. He said, "We should probably be grateful it started when it did. And very careful about what we do next." Chapter 5. What was already known. In order to understand Dr. Rail's reaction, it is necessary to step back from the events of 14th November and consider a broader context. The search for extraterrestrial intelligence, SETI, as it is commonly abbreviated, has been an organized scientific endeavor for over 60 years. Since Frank Drake pointed a radio telescope at two nearby stars in 1960 and listened, hopefully, for something that did not come, generations of researchers have scanned the sky with increasing sophistication and found, with remarkable consistency, nothing. Not quite nothing. There have been anomalies. Signals that briefly suggested pattern, briefly implied structure, briefly made researchers sit forward in their chairs before revealing themselves, upon further analysis, to be natural phenomena or human-made interference. The history of SETI is a history of hope followed by explanation, of mystery briefly glimpsed and then resolved. Except once. In August 1977, a volunteer astronomer named Jerry Amon, reviewing computer-printed data from the Big Ear radio telescope in Ohio, circled a sequence of values in red pen and wrote, in the margin, a single word. Wow! The wow signal, as it became known, was a 72-second burst of radio energy at the hydrogen line frequency, the same frequency as the signal at Ridgeback. It was strong. It was structured. It came from a direction consistent with a point source in deep space. And it was never, despite repeated attempts, detected again. It remains, to this day, unexplained. Dr. Howard Rayl had written his doctoral dissertation on the wow signal. He had spent 30 years thinking about it, analyzing it, and building theoretical frameworks around what it might and might not mean. He was, arguably, the world's leading expert on a signal that had lasted 72 seconds and been observed once. The signal at Ridgeback had now been active for over 2 hours. And it was not going away. There is a document in the Ridgeback Facility Archive, dated 3 weeks after the events of 14th November, that has never been made public. Its existence was mentioned, obliquely, in a letter that Dr. Chen sent to a colleague at a different institution, a letter that was later shared with researchers investigating the case. The colleague, who has asked not to be identified, described the relevant passage of the letter as follows. Mara wrote that Howard had, at some point during the first night, mentioned a classified report he had been briefed on approximately 2 years before the signal. She said he was vague about the details. She wasn't sure if this was because the details were classified or because he himself didn't fully understand them, but the gist of it was this. A signals intelligence agency had, on a date he declined to specify, intercepted a transmission on or near the hydrogen line frequency that had been assessed as non-terrestrial in origin. The assessment had been classified and filed. No scientific institution had been informed. Howard said he had heard about it through a contact at a government laboratory who had mentioned it once, in passing, and then never spoken of it again. What disturbed Mara, she wrote, was not this revelation itself. It was the way Howard described the signal in that classified report. She said he described it as having the same secondary structure. The same thing Owen had noticed. The same pattern inside the pattern. She ended this part of the letter. If this is the second time, Howard, what happened the first time? He wouldn't say. I don't think he knows. I think he's afraid that means there was no one left to report it. Chapter 6. The long hours. At 2 a.m., the signal was still transmitting. Dr. Rayl had established a quiet but firm command of the situation. He had reviewed all documentation, conferred at length with Dr. Chen and assigned Owen to the task of maintaining a continuous audio recording of the raw signal output through the speaker system at a volume low enough to be ambient rather than intrusive. This last instruction, keep it playing, but keep it quiet, seemed to Owen a curious middle ground. Either you listened to it closely and tried to analyze it, or you didn't listen to it at all. Playing it as background seemed like something else entirely, like keeping a thing present without quite confronting it. He didn't say this. He did what he was asked. The control room settled into an uneasy rhythm. Dr. Rail worked at the central station, running analysis after analysis. Dr. Chen monitored the incoming feed and updated the log. Owen watched his console and, in the quiet intervals, listened. The sound in the room was not loud. It was low and layered, and had a quality that Owen later described as gravitational, not literally, obviously, but in the sense that it seemed to draw attention toward itself without doing anything overt to demand it. You could be in the middle of a thought and find, without quite knowing how, that the thought had dissolved and you were simply listening. He noticed this happening to him around 2:30 a.m. He noticed it happening again at 3:15. Both times, when he refocused on his console, he found that he had no clear memory of what he had been listening to or for, only the sensation of having been very attentive to something just beyond his ability to name. At 3:47 a.m., Owen made a log entry that would later become one of the most discussed elements of the Ridgeback case. The entry reads, in full. Secondary layer activity increasing. Pattern density appears to be rising over time, more information per unit time, possibly. Cannot verify analytically without proper decoding tools. Subjective impression. The signal feels like it is building towards something. Like a sentence that is still being constructed. Flagging for Dr. Rail's attention. OPDR. Rail, when he reviewed this entry, did not dismiss it. He noted it, underlined it, and added his own annotation. Consistent with dynamic encoding, signal content may be variable rather than looping. If so, this is not a beacon. This is a message. HR. The distinction is significant. A beacon broadcasts the same thing repeatedly. It is a lighthouse, a marker, a signal that says here we are, here we are, here we are. Most theoretical frameworks for interstellar communication assumed that a first contact signal would be a beacon, simple, repetitive, easily identifiable as artificial. A message is different. A message has content that changes. A message is addressed to someone. A message implies that the sender has something specific to say. At 4:22 a.m., Dr. Chen rotated a dish to attempt a more precise directional fix on the signal source. The result was unexpected. The signal did not have a precise point source. Or rather, it had multiple apparent sources, all in the same general region of sky, but distributed across an arc of approximately 3 degrees. This was, Dr. Chen noted in the log, inconsistent with a single transmitting object at any plausible distance. A single transmitter, at any distance great enough to explain the signal's cosmic origin, would appear as a point source. Multiple apparent sources suggested either multiple transmitters or something about the signal's propagation that defied standard models. She brought this finding to Dr. Rail. He looked at the data for a long time. It's not transmitting from one place, he said. Apparently not, Dr. Chen said. Multiple transmitters, then. That's one explanation. What's the other? Dr. Chen paused. The other explanation, she said carefully, is that the signal isn't coming from a specific location in space. That it's coming from a boundary. The edge of a region. A region of what? She didn't answer right away. I don't know how to describe it, she said finally. The data shows a boundary. On one side of the boundary, there's signal. On the other side, there isn't. The boundary is what's transmitting. Chapter 7. The others. By 5 a.m., they were no longer alone. Dr. Rail, in the early morning hours, had made contact with 3 other facilities. He had been deliberately circumspect, not sharing the details of what the Ridgeback Array was receiving, but asking each facility to check for activity on and around the hydrogen line in the direction of Ophiuchus. He framed the request as a calibration check, as a favor, as a routine cross-correlation exercise. 2 of the 3 facilities reported nothing unusual. The third, a university observatory in rural Chile operated by a team who were, at that hour, in the middle of their own night shift, reported something that made Dr. Rail sit very still for approximately 30 seconds after reading the response. They were receiving it too. Not the same signal, exactly. The Chilean facility was picking up something in the same frequency range, from the same general region of sky, but with a different structure, simpler, less layered, as if they were receiving a different channel of the same transmission. Or, as Dr. Rail would later put it in a private memo, as if they were hearing the outside of what we were hearing the inside of. The Chilean team, 2 graduate students and a postdoctoral researcher named Dr. Valentina Cruz, had been awake and monitoring for 3 hours by the time they were contacted. They had logged the signal as anomalous, attempted to identify a natural source, found none, and were, in their own words, trying to decide how worried to be. Dr. Rail told them, obliquely, that they should be paying close attention. He did not tell them what he suspected. Not yet. Dr. Cruz, who would later become an important figure in the ongoing investigation into the Ridgeback event, described her first impression of the signal in an essay she published 18 months afterward. What struck me first was not the structure of the signal, that came later, when we had time to analyze the data properly. What struck me first was its consistency. Not in the sense of being unchanging, the signal was clearly dynamic, evolving over time in ways we couldn't immediately track. But consistent in a more fundamental sense. Purposeful is the word I keep reaching for. The signal felt purposeful. This is, I recognize, a deeply unscientific thing to say about electromagnetic radiation. Radiation does not have purposes. But I am also committed to describing my genuine experience, and my genuine experience was that this signal felt like it had somewhere to be. Like it was going somewhere. Like it was doing something. The word that kept coming to me, in those first hours, was intentional. And what I found most unsettling about this, unsettling in a way I'm still processing, honestly, years later, was not the implication that something intelligent had sent it. It was the implication that something intelligent had sent it here. To us. To this specific time and place. That is a very different kind of thought. The universe is 13.8 billion years old. For most of that time, there was no one here to receive anything. And then, In this vanishingly brief window of cosmic time during which we happen to exist and happen to have the technology to listen, something sends a signal that we are capable of receiving. The odds against that being coincidence are not astronomical. They are beyond astronomical. They require a different word entirely. Chapter 8. Before dawn. At 6 a.m., there were 4 hours left. No one at Ridgeback knew this yet. No one knew how long the signal would continue. For all they could determine, it might transmit indefinitely, a permanent addition to the radio sky, something they would still be studying in a decade. It would not transmit indefinitely. But at 6 a.m., as the first very faint grayness began to appear at the eastern horizon visible from the control room's rear window, the immediate concern was not duration. The immediate concern was the secondary layer. Dr. Rail had spent the last 2 hours constructing, by hand, a preliminary decoding framework for the secondary layer of the signal. This was slow, painstaking work, not because the methodology was unclear to him, but because he was deliberately proceeding with a caution that exceeded what the purely analytical task demanded. He checked and rechecked each step. He verified each pattern identification multiple times before accepting it. He was, Owen observed, being careful in a way that went beyond scientific rigor. He was being careful in the way that someone is careful when they are afraid of what they might find. At 6:17 a.m., he stopped. He sat at his workstation without moving for 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Owen timed it. Then he stood up, walked to the center of the room, and turned the ambient volume on the speaker system down to 0. The control room went silent. The silence was startling in a way that silence usually isn't, because it was the absence of something that had been present for 7 hours, and the brain, having adjusted to that presence, now registered its removal as a kind of loss. "I need both of you to listen to me, Dr. Rail said. They listened. "What, Dr. Rail told them, standing in the middle of the control room in the pre-dawn quiet, has been reconstructed from the accounts of both Dr. Chen and Owen, which are in substantial agreement. He told them that the secondary layer of the signal contained, embedded within its mathematical structure, a pattern that he had identified as a representation of something, and then he stopped, and chose his words very carefully, and said, "A map. Not a map of space. Not a star chart or a coordinate system or any kind of navigational guide. A map of something else." He didn't say what, immediately. He said that he needed more time to analyze it, that his preliminary identification might be wrong, that he didn't want to characterize something prematurely when the stakes of mischaracterization were so high. Owen asked, "What kind of map?" Dr. Rail looked at him for a moment, and then said something that Owen would repeat, verbatim, in every account he gave of that night. He said, "It appears to be a map of something that shouldn't have a map. Something we assumed was unmappable. Because mapping it would require standing outside of it." Owen didn't understand. He said so. Dr. Rail took a breath. "The pattern," he said, "looks like a representation of physical law. The constants of the universe. The fundamental parameters, the speed of light, the gravitational constant, the fine structure constant. All of them, embedded in the structure of the signal as if they're being described from a position that exists outside the universe that contains them." A silence. "That's not possible, Dr. Chen said. "No, Dr. Rail agreed. It isn't. Chapter 9. What cannot be said? There are things that are difficult to write about in accounts like this one, not because they are frightening or because they are strange, but because language itself becomes unreliable when applied to them. The concept that Dr. Rail was attempting to describe, something that could describe the fundamental parameters of the universe from a position outside those parameters, is one of those things. It is not, strictly speaking, a new concept. Philosophers and theoretical physicists have entertained variations of it for decades. The idea that the universe might be a kind of simulation, or a mathematical structure, or a projection from some higher dimensional reality, these are not fringe ideas. They have been explored, seriously and rigorously, by serious and rigorous thinkers. The anthropic principle, the fine-tuning problem, the question of why the fundamental constants have the specific values they do rather than any of the infinite other values they could have, these are genuine puzzles in contemporary physics, and they genuinely resist resolution within any framework that stays inside the universe they're asking about. But there is a difference between entertaining a concept as a theoretical possibility and receiving, on a cold November night in the New Mexico desert, a transmission that appears to embody that concept in practice. The theory says, perhaps something exists outside the universe. The signal said, here is something that exists outside the universe. Here is its description of where you are. Dr. Chen has said, in subsequent accounts, that her primary reaction to Dr. Rail's analysis was not wonder, and not fear, but something she described as a kind of vertigo, the sensation you get when a floor you trusted turns out not to be where you thought it was. She had built her career on the understanding that the universe was, in principle, knowable. That every phenomenon had a mechanism, every signal had a source, every pattern had a generator that operated according to laws that existed within the same reality as the observer. This was not naive, she was well aware of the limits of current knowledge, the mysteries that remained, the phenomena that current models struggled to accommodate. But she had always understood those mysteries as things that existed within the frame. Questions that could, in principle, be answered from inside the picture. The signal was not inside the picture. Or at least, if Dr. Rail's preliminary analysis was correct, its origin was not. I kept thinking, she said, about what it means for something to be described from outside. And then I kept thinking about what it means for that outside thing to know that we're here. To know our address, essentially. Our coordinates in a system we didn't know existed. She paused. We've spent decades listening for signals, pointing our telescopes outward and waiting. The entire premise of that endeavor is that we are the listeners, and whatever is out there is the transmitter. We are the receivers. But if something knows our parameters, knows the shape of our reality from outside it, then maybe the relationship is different. Maybe it has always been different. Maybe we were never doing the listening. Maybe we were always the signal. Chapter 10. 7:41 a.m. The signal continued through Sunrise. The sky over the high desert shifted from black to deep blue to a pale, clear, ice-cold morning. The lights inside the control room, which had been harsh and yellow all through the night, now competed with the growing daylight from the windows and seemed, somehow, to lose the quality of illumination and become simply visible strips of fluorescent tubing glowing without purpose. Owen, who had been awake for over 12 hours by this point, had the slightly dissociated feeling that comes from extended sleeplessness, the sense that the present moment was slightly untethered from the normal chain of cause and effect. He was also, he has said, acutely aware of the signal. Not hearing it, Dr. Rail had turned the speakers off, and they had stayed off, but aware of it, in the sense of knowing it was there, in the data streams flowing across his monitor, in the structure of the numbers, present and unceasing. At 7:41 a.m., Dr. Rail received a phone call. He took it outside the control room. Owen and Dr. Chen remained at their stations. Through the small window set into the control room door, Owen could see Dr. Rail standing in the corridor, phone pressed to his ear, not speaking. Just listening. The call lasted 4 minutes. When Dr. Rail returned to the control room, his expression was, in Owen's description, like someone who has just been told something that confirms a fear they had hoped was irrational. He sat down. "We have to make a decision," he said. "About what?" Dr. Chen asked. "About whether to attempt a response." Chapter 11. The question of reply. The ethics and practicalities of responding to a potential extraterrestrial signal have been debated in academic and policy circles for as long as SETI has existed as an organized endeavor. There is no consensus. There is not even close to a consensus. On one side of the argument, if something is transmitting to us, the courteous and scientifically productive response is to transmit back, to confirm receipt, to establish a dialogue. This view treats contact as an intrinsically desirable outcome, assumes benign or at worst neutral intent on the part of the transmitter, and frames the exchange as the beginning of an intellectual and perhaps civilizational relationship of enormous potential value. On the other side, responding to an unidentified signal from an unknown source with unknown capabilities and unknown intentions is an act of profound, irreversible consequence. We do not know where it came from. We do not know what it wants. We do not know what our response might invite. Stephen Hawking, among others, noted that when two civilizations of vastly different technological capacity have encountered each other throughout human history, the outcome for the less advanced has rarely been benign. There is no reason to assume interstellar contact would be different. These are, of course, arguments about extraterrestrial intelligence in the conventional sense, beings from another star, another world, operating within the same universe and subject to the same physical laws. The signal at Ridgeback, if Dr. Rail's analysis was correct, came from something that was not operating within those constraints. And that changed the calculation in ways that no existing framework was equipped to address. The phone call, Dr. Rail said, when Owen asked who had contacted him, was from someone who has been tracking this signal from a different location. Who has been tracking it, I should say, for longer than we have. How much longer? Dr. Chen asked. Dr. Rail didn't answer this directly. He said, long enough to have formed some views about what it is, and very specific views about whether we should respond. What are those views? That we should not, Dr. Rail said. Under any circumstances. Not yet. Why not yet? He looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked up. Because they have not been able to determine whether the signal is informational or operational, he said. Those are different things. An informational signal is a message, it carries content, it describes something, it communicates. An operational signal does something. It isn't describing a process. It is a process. It acts on what receives it. A silence. Acts on it how? Owen asked. That, Dr. Rail said, is what they haven't been able to determine. The distinction between informational and operational signals is not, in the context of terrestrial radio communication, a particularly fraught one. Radio signals carry information. They do not, typically, do things to the receivers. A radio broadcast is heard, it does not rewrite the listener. But this distinction, in more exotic contexts, begins to blur. Consider. A computer virus is, at the most fundamental level, information. A sequence of data. And yet, when received and processed by the right system, it does something. It acts. It changes the system that receives it. The key phrase is the right system. A virus written for one operating system does nothing on another. It requires a receiver capable of processing it in the specific way the virus was designed to exploit. The question that the unidentified contact, the person who had called Dr. Rail on his phone in the early morning hours, was apparently wrestling with was this. If the signal from Ridgeback was operational rather than informational, what was the receiver it was designed for? Not a radio telescope. Not a computer. Something else. Something biological, perhaps. Chapter 12. Owen Price left Ridgeback at 8:30 a.m. on 15th November, having been awake for over 15 consecutive hours. He drove to his apartment in Socorro, approximately 47 miles north, and went to sleep. He slept for 11 hours. When he woke, in the early evening, he sat on the edge of his bed for a long time and tried to reconstruct the sequence of the previous night. Not because he had forgotten it, he remembered it with a clarity that would not diminish with time, but because there was one element of it that he was having difficulty placing in the right order. He could not determine exactly when he had first understood something. This is how he described it. In a written account he composed approximately a month after the event. I don't mean I understood the signal, I want to be clear about that. I don't mean I decoded it or analyzed it or arrived at any intellectual conclusion about its content. What I mean is something more basic and, in some ways, more disturbing. I mean that at some point during the hours I sat in that control room, something in the signal, something in the ambient version of it, playing at low volume in the background while I watched my monitor, communicated something to me. Not in words. Not in any representational form I can describe. In the way that music can communicate an emotional state without being about that emotional state. In the way that a physical space can feel welcoming or threatening without any specific feature of it being the cause. What I understood or felt that I understood, or felt that had been made available for me to understand, was something about the signal's purpose. Not the content of it. The purpose. Why it existed. What it was for. And what I understood, what was made available, was that it wasn't looking for us. It had already found us. It had always known we were here. And it was not, at its most fundamental level, a form of communication at all. It was a form of recognition. Something was recognizing us. Not discovering us. Recognizing us. The way you recognize something you made. He went on. I want to be extremely careful here about how I'm describing this, because I'm aware of how it sounds, and I'm aware of the ways in which people under conditions of sleep deprivation and stress can construct false meaning from ambiguous stimuli. I know this. I've read enough cognitive science to understand the mechanisms. I am not, by temperament, a person who is easily moved toward mystical or supernatural explanations. I approach these things with skepticism. But skepticism requires that I take my own experience seriously as data. And the data is. I came away from that control room with a conviction, calm, clear, not anxious, not euphoric, just present, that what we had received was not, at its deepest level, a message from somewhere far away. It was a signal from something that had no distance from us at all. That was its most unsettling quality. Not the distance. The proximity. Chapter 13. The Last Hours. At 10 a.m. on 15th November, while Owen was sleeping, the signal at Ridgeback entered what Dr. Chen would later describe as its terminal phase. She was alone in the control room at this point. Dr. Rail had left briefly to make a series of phone calls from his car, a precaution against the facility's systems logging the calls. A technician had arrived for the day shift but had been asked to remain in the break room for reasons Dr. Chen did not fully explain to him. The terminal phase was characterized by a series of changes in the signal's structure. The prime sequence in the primary layer began, for the first time in over 11 hours, to alter. The primes were still there, but the intervals between them were changing, compressing, as if the sequence was accelerating. In the waterfall display, the pattern that had been relatively stable throughout the night began to develop new features. Additional subharmonics, unexpected frequency excursions, and most significantly, a progressive increase in the signal's overall complexity. Dr. Chen logged all of this in real time, with the methodical precision that was her default mode. But she also noted, in the log, something more subjective. The signal has changed in character. Not just structure, character. If I had to describe it in purely subjective terms, it feels less like receiving and more like approaching. Like the signal is drawing closer. Not in physical space, the triangulation data shows no change in apparent source position. In some other dimension of proximity that I don't have language for. I am noting this because I think it may be relevant. I am aware it is not standard scientific notation. I am logging it anyway. At 11:47 a.m., Dr. Rail returned to the control room. He reviewed the terminal phase data with a focused intensity that Dr. Chen found, in her own words, almost frightening, not because of what he was doing, but because of how certain he looked. Like someone watching something he had predicted come true and finding no comfort in the accuracy of the prediction. At 12:08 p.m., Dr. Rail said, "It's going to end soon." "How do you know?" Dr. Chen asked. "The structure," he said. "It's completing. Whatever it was encoding in that secondary layer, the map, or whatever the right word is, it's finished now. The message, if it is a message, has been fully transmitted." "And then what?" He was quiet for a moment. "And then we decide what to do with what we received," he said. At 3:29 p.m., 4 hours, 17 minutes, and 8 seconds after Dr. Rail's statement, the signal stopped. Not gradually. not with a fade or a deterioration or any of the signs of a natural signal's end. It stopped as cleanly and as completely as a switch being thrown. One moment it was there, fully formed, unchanged in its character. The next moment it was gone. The control room was silent. Dr. Chen looked at her monitor. The waterfall display showed only background noise, the ordinary, random, structureless static of the cosmic microwave background. The radio sky returned to its usual state, as if nothing had happened. She sat for a moment. Then she said, "Log the termination time." She already knew it, but saying it was a way of doing something, of performing the ordinary functions of an ordinary job in the face of something that had been neither. Chapter 14. What remained? In the days that followed the signal's termination, 3 things happened that are worth noting. The first was institutional. Within 48 hours of the end of the transmission, Dr. Rail received a formal communication from an agency he declined to identify, informing him that the data recorded by the Ridgeback Array during the event was subject to a national security review and requesting that all raw data files be preserved but not distributed or published pending the outcome of that review. Dr. Rail complied. The review was, as of the last publicly available information, still ongoing. The second was personal. Dr. Chen took a leave of absence from the university 3 weeks after the event. She cited health reasons. She spent 4 months at her sister's home in Oregon, largely off the grid, before returning to work. She has never publicly discussed what she experienced during those 4 months, and the few colleagues who have spoken to her since describe her as changed, not broken, not diminished, but operating on a slightly different frequency than before. As if she recalibrated to something. The third was unexplained. Among the data files logged during the 4 hours and 17 minutes of the signal, there was one file that was not generated by the array's standard monitoring systems. It was found in the personal recording folder of the secondary monitoring station, the station where Owen had been seated throughout the night. It was an audio file, 43 seconds long, of unknown provenance. The array's logging system recorded that this file had been created at 3:28 and 22 seconds p.m., 38 seconds before the signal terminated. Owen Price, at that time, was asleep in his apartment in Socorro, 47 miles away. The secondary monitoring station had not been accessed by any logged user since Owen's departure at 8:30 a.m. The control room's security camera log showed no one approaching the secondary station during the hours between Owen's departure and the file's creation. The file was, by all available evidence, created by no one. The audio file has been described by the small number of people who have heard it in terms that are remarkably consistent, despite the fact that these listeners had no contact with each other and offered their descriptions independently. Every one of them described the same 2 qualities. First, it sounded like breathing. Not human breathing, exactly, it was slower, deeper, and had a quality that one listener described as structural, like the breathing was load-bearing somehow, like it was keeping something in place. Second, underneath the breathing, there was a tone. A single, unwavering tone. Not at the hydrogen line frequency. Not at any frequency that the Ridgeback Array's instruments were designed to detect. At a frequency that, when converted to a physical measurement, corresponded precisely to one of the fundamental constants of the universe that Dr. Rayl had identified in the secondary layer's map a constant that should not, under any conventional model of physics, be expressible as a sound. But there it was. 43 seconds of it. The file has never been explained. It has never been publicly released. Its existence is known only through the accounts of the few people who have been given access to the case files, and even among those people, there is significant disagreement about whether what they heard was what they thought they heard, or whether the act of knowing the story before hearing the file shaped their interpretation of its contents. This is a legitimate concern. It is also, in the context of everything else about the Ridgeback case, a relatively small one. Chapter 15. Dr. Krause. Dr. Valentina Krause, the researcher at the Chilean observatory who had also received the signal on the night of 14th November, did not take a leave of absence. She did not comply with any institutional request to restrict her data, partly because no such request reached her and partly because, as she has noted wryly, the agency responsible presumably didn't know a small university observatory in the Atacama was also listening. She published a paper. It was not, as these things go, a widely read paper. It appeared in a mid-year journal focused on radio astronomy, had a technical title that revealed little about its contents, and was written in a deliberately restrained style that kept the more extraordinary interpretations subordinate to the raw data. But it was read by those in the relevant community. And its conclusions, stated carefully and qualified extensively, as academic conclusions must be, were, in the words of one reviewer, either the most important paper published in this decade or the most elaborate methodological error in the history of the field. The paper's central finding was this. The signal received at the Chilean observatory on the night of 14th November was, in certain measurable ways, different from the signal received at Ridgeback. Not completely different. The carrier frequency was the same. The general structure was the same. The prime sequence was present in both. But the secondary layer was different. At Ridgeback, the secondary layer appeared to encode a map of physical constants, a description of the universe's fundamental parameters. At the Chilean observatory, the secondary layer encoded something else. It encoded, "This is Dr. Krause' finding," stated cautiously and with extensive qualification, a description of a biological system. Specifically, a neural system. A representation of something that processes information. Something that thinks. Not a specific brain. Not a specific organism. A general representation, abstract, mathematical, like an architect's drawing of a brain rather than a scan of one. But detailed. Extraordinarily detailed. And the detail was not of a brain in general. It was of a brain receiving a signal. The signal, embedded in its own secondary layer, contained a description of what receiving the signal did to the receiver. Dr. Krause's interpretation of this finding, in the concluding section of her paper, is measured and precise and still manages to be one of the most unsettling scientific statements committed to print in recent memory. She wrote, "If the secondary layer encoding at the observed frequency is accurately interpreted as a representation of neural information processing, and if that representation corresponds to the state of a receiving biological system, we are faced with a signal that is, in a meaningful sense, self-referential. It describes its own reception. It contains, within its structure, an account of what it does to be received. The implications of this are difficult to bound. One interpretation, and I present it as one interpretation among several, is that the signal is not merely communicative but constitutive. That it does not simply describe a neural state, it specifies one. That receiving the signal is, in some sense, the event the signal is about. I do not know what to make of this. I do not think any existing framework is adequate to make of it what it deserves. I am logging it as accurately as I am able, because that is what I can do. The signal lasted 4 hours, 17 minutes, and 8 seconds. At Ridgeback and at our facility, and I have subsequently learned at a small number of other locations that were monitoring the relevant frequency band that night, each receiving a different layer of the same transmission. I have been in contact with the other researchers. We are, all of us, attempting to understand what we received. We are, all of us, proceeding carefully. What I can say with confidence is this. The night of 14th November was not the beginning of contact. Contact, in the sense of influence, in the sense of something from outside the observable universe touching the inside of it, may predate our ability to detect it by an interval we cannot measure. The question we are trying to answer is not whether contact has occurred. The question is what contact means. Chapter 16. The Quiet Years. The years that followed the Ridgeback event were, for most of the people involved, years of quiet processing. Dr. Rail continued to work at the facility for 18 months after the event, then took early retirement. He relocated to a small town in Vermont and, by all accounts, spent his days walking, reading, and corresponding extensively with a circle of researchers that included Dr. Cruz and several others whose names have not been made public. He declined all interview requests. He declined all speaking invitations. He was not, by the accounts of people who knew him, a man in distress. He was, in the words of one colleague who visited him in Vermont, at peace in a way that was more unsettling than unhappiness would have been. Like someone who has seen something that resolved a question they'd spent their life asking, and found that the resolution was not what they expected, and is now living with the answer. Dr. Chen returned to research after her leave of absence and continued her career with apparent normalcy for several years. Those who knew her before and after the event noted subtle changes, a tendency to spend more time on the boundary cases, the edge phenomena, the signals that didn't quite fit. She published several papers on anomalous radio phenomena that were received with polite interest by the mainstream community and more intense interest by the smaller community that had been following the Ridgeback case. In interviews, she was careful, precise, and said nothing she couldn't defend. She had one interview, given to a small science podcast with a few thousand listeners, in which she was asked late in the conversation, after the formal topics had been covered, what she thought the signal was. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think it was a proof." The interviewer asked, "A proof of what?" "That the universe is inside something," she said. "And that something inside the universe, us, I suppose, or whatever has been listening long enough, had become complex enough to receive a signal from outside it. And that the something outside chose to send one." She paused. "I don't think it was an accident," she said. "The timing. I don't think we happened to be here when it transmitted. I think it transmitted because we were here. Because whatever threshold we had to cross to be capable of receiving it, we crossed it. Recently, maybe. On cosmic timescales, very recently." "What threshold?" the interviewer asked. She thought about this. I think the threshold might be doubt, she said. The capacity to ask whether we're alone. The capacity to point instruments at the sky and wonder. I don't think every species that evolves the capacity to receive the signal necessarily receives it. But I think whatever is transmitting, whatever exists outside the frame, I think it notices when something inside the frame starts looking. Starts asking. She paused again. And I think 14th November was its answer. Chapter 17. What the map said. In the 2 years following the Ridgeback event, a small, informal, and largely unofficial group of researchers drawn from the institutions that had received some portion of the signal worked, in their own time and without institutional support, to reconstruct as complete a picture of the transmission as their collective data allowed. This work was slow and difficult, and complicated by the fact that each institution had received a different portion of the signal's layered structure. The full picture required all the pieces, and assembling all the pieces required a level of trust and collaboration that does not come easily to people who have been advised, officially or unofficially, to be cautious about what they share. But it came. Slowly, haltingly, over many months of encrypted correspondence and one in-person meeting held at Dr. Cruz Observatory in Chile that lasted 3 days and was, by all accounts, an experience that affected everyone present. What they assembled, the partial reconstruction, the best picture they could construct from the available data was not, in the end, what they had expected. The map that Dr. Rail had identified in Ridgeback's secondary layer was not a map of physical constants alone. The physical constants were a kind of key, a reference frame, a way of saying here is the system I am describing, these are its rules, these are the numbers that make it what it is. What the map was mapping, using those constants as reference points, was time. Not the flow of time. Not a timeline of events. Something more fundamental. The structure of time itself, the way it is shaped by the distribution of mass and energy in the universe, the way it curves and stretches and, in extreme conditions, ceases to behave like time at all. The map showed the universe's temporal structure from the outside. It showed time the way a 4-dimensional being would see a 3-dimensional object, not from within, not as a sequence experienced one moment after another, but all at once, the whole shape of it, beginning and whatever comes after beginning, laid out in a geometry that the researchers, working within time's interior, could only partially and haltingly comprehend. And in that geometry, in the shape of time as seen from outside, there were markings. Specific locations. Specific moments. Coordinates in the universal temporal structure. Most of them were unidentifiable. They might have been significant events in cosmic history, or they might have been something else entirely. The researchers had no way to anchor most of the coordinates to anything they recognized. But one of them, one specific temporal coordinate, corresponded, when translated back into their own reference frame, into their own experience of time from inside it, to a date approximately 2000 years in their future. Chapter 18. What happens at the coordinate? The researchers spent a great deal of time and thought on the question of what the temporal coordinate meant. There were multiple possibilities, and they considered all of them with the rigor that their individual disciplines demanded. The most prosaic. It was an error. A misinterpretation of the data. A pattern identified where no pattern was intended. This was always the most likely explanation, in the statistical sense, and it was never fully eliminated. The somewhat less prosaic. It was a significant astronomical event. A supernova, a gamma ray burst, a collision of galactic bodies, something that the outside observer had calculated would be visible from Earth's position on approximately that date. An astronomical almanac of cosmic events, with one flagged as particularly noteworthy. The considerably less prosaic. It was a deadline. The researchers, when they reached this possibility, spent a long time being careful about how they defined the word. A deadline is not necessarily an ending. It is a threshold, a point by which something must occur, or after which something changes. The coordinate might mark the boundary of a window. A window for what was not clear. The interpretation that none of the researchers felt entirely comfortable dismissing, despite the discomfort of entertaining it, was this. The coordinate marked the point at which the universe would be recognizable to whatever sent the signal. Not in the sense of being visible to it, presumably the outside observer had always had visibility. In a different sense. The sense in which a developing thing becomes recognizable as what it was always becoming. The sense in which a long, slow process arrives at the condition that the process was for. 2000 years. This is, in cosmic terms, nothing. It is less than nothing, a rounding error in the age of the universe. It is, in human terms, a very long time. Long enough for every person alive on the day of the signal to be gone, and their children, and their children's children, many times over. But it is also close enough to feel immediate. Close enough to feel relevant. Close enough to wonder. Chapter 19. The question of purpose. The question that the researchers came back to, again and again, in their long encrypted correspondences, was the question of purpose. Not the purpose of the signal, they had varying views on that, and the views shifted over time. But the purpose of the signal in relation to them. Why tell them? If something outside the universe had mapped its temporal structure and identified a coordinate 2000 years ahead, why transmit that map to a small and short-lived species on a single planet around an unremarkable star in one of billions of galaxies? Several answers were proposed. The most optimistic. To give them time to prepare. For what, exactly, was unclear, but the act of sending the map implied that preparation was possible. That what came at the coordinate was not inevitable in the sense of being unsurvivable. That choices made between now and then mattered. The most unsettling. To create the coordinate. To ensure that something existed, at that point in temporal space, that was capable of performing whatever function the coordinate represented. That the signal was less a notification than a seed. That they were the preparation. The most philosophically vertiginous. That the act of receiving the signal and understanding it, or attempting to understand it, was itself the event. That the coordinate marked the moment of maximum understanding. That what would happen in 2000 years was not something that would be done to humanity or done by humanity, but something that would be understood by it. A threshold of comprehension. A moment of seeing. And that everything between now and then was the approach. Chapter 20. Owen, 2 years later. Owen Price completed his doctoral program. He received his degree in radio astronomy and took a postdoctoral position at a university in the Pacific Northwest. He is, by all accounts, a capable and well-regarded young researcher. He does not talk publicly about the night of 14th November. He talks about it privately, with people he trusts, in the careful and measured way of someone who has thought a great deal about how to say something accurately and still cannot quite make the words do what he needs them to do. In one such conversation, with a former colleague who subsequently shared an account of it, with Owen's permission, with the researchers investigating the case, Owen said this: "What stays with me isn't the analysis. It isn't the prime sequence or the map or any of the intellectual content. That's all extraordinary, and I think about it constantly, but it's not the thing that changed something. The thing that changed something was the feeling at about 3 in the morning, sitting in that control room, listening to what the signal sounded like when it played at low volume in the background. Not analyzing it. Just coexisting with it. And the feeling was, and I know this doesn't translate well, the feeling was that I was being addressed directly. Not me personally. Not my name or my history. Something more basic. The fact of me. The fact of consciousness. The fact of being a thing that experiences. Whatever I am at my most fundamental level, whatever all of us are at our most fundamental level, that was what was being addressed. That was what was being recognized. And the recognition was not frightening. I want to make that clear. It was the most attended to feeling I've ever had. The feeling of being seen completely, and found, not lacking, but found. Sufficient. The right kind of thing. I don't know how else to say it. I felt like the universe had been waiting for something to be capable of this moment. And that we had arrived at it. And that whatever is outside the universe, whatever sent the signal, had been paying attention the whole time. Waiting for us to be ready to hear it. I have absolutely no way to verify this feeling. I have no evidence for it beyond the fact that I felt it. I am aware it might be nothing more than the sleep-deprived brain of a 26-year-old constructing meaning in conditions designed to maximize ambiguity. But it's real. In whatever sense feelings are real. It happened. And I would rather be the person who had that feeling in that room on that night than anyone who wasn't. Even knowing everything that came after. Even not knowing everything that's still coming. I would rather have been there. Chapter 21. The frequency of everything. There is a way of thinking about the universe that treats it as a vast and essentially indifferent place, old beyond comprehension, large beyond imagination, governed by laws that were not designed with any particular outcome in mind and that care nothing for the beings that find themselves briefly alive within them. This view is coherent. It is internally consistent. It has a great deal to recommend it. There is another way of thinking about the universe that treats it as a place in which, somehow and against all probability, complexity increases over time. In which atoms become molecules, and molecules become cells, and cells become organisms, and organisms become minds. In which minds, once they exist, begin to look outward and ask questions. In which the asking of questions is, perhaps, the thing the universe has been building toward all along, the thing it has been doing for 13.8 billion years, through countless iterations of stars burning and dying and seeding the void with the elements that make everything else possible. This view is also coherent. It is also internally consistent. The signal at Ridgeback does not definitively confirm either view. But it complicates the first one considerably. An indifferent universe does not send signals. An indifferent universe does not track the development of consciousness on a small planet and wait for the moment when that consciousness is capable of receiving a transmission from outside the frame. An indifferent universe does not embed, in the secondary layer of a signal broadcast on the hydrogen line frequency, a map of temporal structure with a coordinate placed exactly far enough ahead to be reachable but not so far ahead as to be meaningless. An indifferent universe does not do any of this, because an indifferent universe is not paying attention. Something was paying attention. Something had been paying attention for a very long time. And on 14th November, at 11:12 p.m. local time in the New Mexico desert, it let us know. Chapter 22. What we do with it. We are left, at the end of this account, with the question of what to do with what has been described here. The signal is gone. It is not transmitting. Every instrument pointed at the coordinates in Ophiuchus shows only background noise, the ordinary static of an unspecial patch of sky. Whatever was there or appeared to be there is not detectably present. The data remains. It is archived, analyzed, argued over. It is the subject of unpublished papers and encrypted correspondences and 3-day meetings in Chilean observatories. It will be the subject of more. The people who were there, who sat in that control room, or who were awake in Chile, or who reviewed the data in the weeks that followed, they continue their lives. They are changed in ways both subtle and profound. They are not, any of them, the same people they would have been if 14th November had been an ordinary night. And somewhere ahead, 2000 years, give or take the uncertainty of our translation, there is a coordinate. A marking in the structure of time as seen from outside it. A specific moment that something considered significant enough to flag. We will not be there. Not us, personally. Not anyone alive today. But something will be there. Something that is, in some continuous and unbroken sense, descended from the species that built the radio telescopes and pointed them at the sky and listened. Something that will be, in some meaningful way, the result of everything between now and then, every choice, every question, every moment of attention. Something that will arrive at the coordinate carrying, perhaps without knowing it, the inheritance of a night in November when a signal came from nowhere, and lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes, and changed the people who received it in ways that language can almost, but not quite, contain. We don't know what will happen at the coordinate. We don't know if it will be understood when it comes. But the signal was sent. It was received. The message, whatever its deepest content, arrived. And somewhere, in the structure of a universe that something outside it is watching, a threshold was crossed. We crossed it together. In a low-ceilinged room with flickering fluorescent lights, at the edge of the desert, in the dark before dawn. That is enough. That has to be enough. Epilogue. The Ridgeback Array continues to operate. Dishes point at the sky. Data flows. Anomaly alerts trigger and are investigated and are almost always explained. No signal like 14th November has been received since. Dr. Rail, in his last known public statement, a brief letter published in a small newsletter for retired researchers, wrote, "I have been asked many times what I believe the signal meant. I have been careful, in response to this question, to say that I do not know. This is true. But I think I can now say something more. I believe the signal was not primarily a communication, not in the way we think of communication, as the transfer of information from a sender to a receiver. I believe it was primarily an act of acknowledgement. Of being acknowledged. Of having the fact of our existence, the remarkable, improbable, fleeting, extraordinary fact of our existence, noticed and named by something that exists on a scale we cannot currently imagine. Whether that is frightening or comforting probably depends on the person. For me, in the end, it is simply true. And truth, however strange, is what I came here to find. He signed it, HR. And below his name, in parentheses, he wrote one more thing. 2 words. Keep listening.